The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant Major James Wellington adjusted his ceremonial uniform for what he believed would be another routine day. At 52, Wellington had served the royal family for over 3 decades, witnessing countless moments of joy, sorrow, and everything in between. His weathered face bore the lines of a man who had dedicated his life to duty, honor, and protecting those he served. Wellington had been present during some of the most significant moments in recent royal history. He remembered the day Princess Diana died, standing guard as the nation mourned. He had been there when Prince William married Catherine, ensuring security was tight while the world celebrated. Most recently, he had stood vigil during Queen Elizabeth II's final days, watching as the woman he had sworn to protect gradually weakened. The Queen's death 3 months earlier had shaken everyone at the palace, but perhaps none more so than Wellington. She had been more than just his sovereign. She had been a constant in his life, a symbol of stability in an ever-changing world. He had watched her age gracefully, always maintaining her dignity and sense of duty that inspired everyone around her. Now, King Charles III sat on the throne, and with him came changes that made many longtime palace staff uncomfortable. But it wasn't the new king who worried Wellington most. It was Queen Camilla and the way she seemed to be making decisions that felt wrong to those who had served the late queen faithfully. On this particular morning, Wellington received an unusual summons to the Queen's private office. As he walked through the familiar corridors, his military-trained mind automatically noted the subtle changes that had occurred since Camilla became queen consort. New artwork hung on walls where the late queen's personal photographs once resided. Different flowers adorned the tables, and even the staff seemed to move with less certainty than before. Wellington knocked on the office door and entered when beckoned. Queen Camilla sat behind the ornate desk, papers spread before her, a fountain pen in her hand. She looked up as he entered, her expression businesslike and somewhat distant. "Sergeant Major Wellington," she said, her voice carrying an authority that still felt new to both of them. "I've called you here regarding some administrative matters that need to be handled discreetly." Wellington stood at attention, his hands clasped behind his back. "Of course, Your Majesty. How may I be of service?" Camilla gestured to a chair, but Wellington remained standing, a habit ingrained through decades of military service. She pulled out a document from the stack before her, and Wellington could see official letterhead and what appeared to be legal text. "The late Queen's private jet," Camilla began, her tone matter-of-fact, "has been sitting unused in the royal hangar. It's a valuable asset that shouldn't remain idle, especially given the current economic climate and the public scrutiny of royal expenses." Wellington felt a slight tension in his chest. The private jet had been one of Queen Elizabeth's few personal indulgences, purchased with her own money rather than public funds. She had used it sparingly, mainly for private family trips and personal matters that required discretion. "I understand, Your Majesty," Wellington replied carefully, unsure where the conversation was heading. Camilla lifted the document, and Wellington could see it was some sort of transfer agreement. "I've decided to sign ownership of the aircraft over to Prince Tom," she continued. "He's shown great responsibility lately, and I believe he could make good use of it for his charitable endeavors." Wellington's military composure almost cracked. Prince Tom was Camilla's son from her first marriage, and while he was a decent enough young man, the idea of transferring Queen Elizabeth's personal property to him felt deeply wrong. The jet held sentimental value beyond its monetary worth. It represented the late Queen's independence and her rare moments of personal freedom. "Your Majesty," Wellington said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "might I inquire whether this decision has been discussed with His Majesty the King?" Camilla's eyes narrowed slightly. "This is my decision to make, Sergeant Major. The aircraft was left to me in the Queen's personal effects, and I have every right to dispose of it as I see fit." Wellington knew this wasn't entirely accurate. While Camilla may have inherited certain items, the jet's ownership was more complicated, involving both personal and royal assets. More importantly, it represented a piece of the late Queen's legacy that shouldn't be given away so casually. "I understand your position, Your Majesty," Wellington said, his voice steady but firm. However, I believe this matter requires more careful consideration. The late Queen was very particular about her personal belongings and their significance to the royal family's heritage. The room fell silent except for the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. Camilla stared at Wellington, clearly not expecting resistance from a staff member. Her pen hovered over the signature line of the document. "Are you questioning my authority, Sergeant Major?" she asked, her voice taking on a colder edge. Wellington met her gaze directly. "I am expressing concern about a decision that may have lasting consequences, Your Majesty. It is my duty to speak when I believe the Crown's interests are at stake." The confrontation that would change everything was about to begin. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Queen Camilla set down her pen and leaned back in her chair, studying Wellington with a look that could freeze water. For 30 years, he had never directly challenged royal authority. But something about this moment felt different, as if the very soul of the monarchy was being tested. "Sergeant Major," Camilla said, her voice now carrying the full weight of her position, "I'm not sure you understand your place in this palace. You are here to follow orders, not to give advice on matters that don't concern you." Wellington felt his heart racing, but his exterior remained calm. He had faced enemy fire in his younger days, stood guard during terrorist threats, and protected royals through countless dangerous situations. This was different, though. This was about protecting something intangible but equally precious: the memory and wishes of the woman he had served faithfully for decades. "With all due respect, Your Majesty," Wellington replied, his voice steady, "everything that affects this family's legacy concerns me. I took an oath to protect not just the physical safety of the royals, but their honor and reputation as well." Camilla stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Your oath is to obey, not to lecture me about honor and reputation. I've been part of this family longer than you might think, and I understand its needs better than a security guard ever could." The words stung, but Wellington remained focused. "The late Queen specifically mentioned her concerns about this aircraft in my presence. She worried about what would happen to her personal belongings after her death, whether they would be treated with the respect they deserved." This was partially true. Queen Elizabeth had indeed expressed concerns about her legacy, though she hadn't specifically mentioned the jet to Wellington. But he felt justified in stretching the truth if it meant protecting her memory. Camilla's expression changed, uncertainty flickering across her features for just a moment. "What exactly did she say?" Wellington took a calculated risk. "She said that her personal aircraft represented her independence and that she hoped it would remain available for future monarchs to use when they needed privacy for family matters. She didn't want it to become just another commodity to be given away." The room fell silent again. Wellington could hear his own heartbeat and the distant sounds of palace life continuing outside the office walls. He was walking a dangerous line, but he felt compelled to continue. "Your Majesty, Prince Tom is a fine young man, but he is not a working royal. The aircraft could serve a much better purpose remaining with the Crown, available for official but private royal business. The late Queen would have wanted it to continue serving the monarchy, not to become someone's personal luxury." Camilla moved to the window, looking out at the gardens where her late mother-in-law had spent countless hours. For a moment, she seemed less like a queen and more like a woman trying to navigate complicated family dynamics while establishing her own authority. "You don't understand the complexities of this family, Sergeant Major," she said without turning around. "Tom has been unfairly excluded from so many things simply because he's my son and not Charles's. This would be a way to show that he matters, that he's valued." Wellington realized he was seeing behind the royal facade, glimpsing the personal motivations driving this decision. This wasn't really about the jet. It was about Camilla trying to secure her son's position within a family that had never fully accepted him. "I understand more than you might think, Your Majesty," Wellington said gently. "I've watched this family for 3 decades. I've seen how complicated these relationships can be. But making rash decisions about the late Queen's belongings isn't the way to solve those problems. It will only create new ones." Camilla turned back to face him, her eyes flashing with anger. "Rash decisions? I am the Queen Consort of England. I don't make rash decisions, and I certainly don't need advice from someone whose job is to stand quietly in corners and look intimidating." Wellington felt his own temper rising but forced it down. My job is to protect this family from all threats, including threats to their reputation and legacy. Right now, the biggest threat I see is this decision being made in anger rather than wisdom." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Both of them knew they had crossed into territory that couldn't be easily navigated back from. Wellington had essentially accused the Queen of acting emotionally and unwisely, something that could end his career instantly. Camilla walked back to her desk and picked up the pen again. "I'm going to sign this document, Sergeant Major, and if you have any further objections, you're welcome to take them up with His Majesty. Though I suspect he'll be more interested in why one of his security staff thinks he can dictate royal policy." Wellington watched as she positioned the pen over the signature line. He had one more card to play, and he hoped it would be enough. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "before you sign that, you should know that the late Queen's personal secretary kept detailed records of all her conversations about her belongings. If this decision is ever questioned publicly, those records will be examined. Are you certain this is how you want to be remembered? As the Queen who gave away her predecessor's treasures?" Camilla's hand froze above the paper. The implication was clear. If this became public, it would be a scandal that could damage her reputation permanently. The pen trembled slightly in Camilla's hand as Wellington's words sank in. She set it down on the desk and stared at the document, her mind racing through the potential consequences of her actions. The palace had weathered many scandals over the years, but something like this, perceived as greedy or disrespectful to the beloved late Queen, could be devastating. "Are you threatening me, Sergeant Major?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Wellington maintained his professional demeanor, though inside he felt like he was walking across a minefield. "I'm simply informing you of facts that you should consider before making this decision, Your Majesty. The Palace Secretary's office maintains comprehensive records. It's standard procedure." This was true. The palace kept meticulous records of royal activities and conversations. Wellington was gambling that somewhere in those files was documentation that would support his position, even if he wasn't certain of the specific details. Camilla began pacing behind her desk, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "You seem to forget that I have been part of this family's inner circle for many years. I know how things work here, and I know what the late Queen would have wanted. Do you?" Wellington asked, the question slipping out before he could stop himself. The boldness of his response shocked them both. For a moment, the carefully maintained hierarchy of the palace crumbled, leaving just two people facing each other over a fundamental disagreement about right and wrong. Camilla stopped pacing and fixed him with a stare that could have melted steel. "How dare you question my knowledge of this family? I loved Elizabeth. I respected her. I would never do anything to dishonor her memory." Wellington felt a pang of sympathy for the woman before him. He could see that she was struggling with grief, guilt, and the enormous pressure of her new role. But that didn't change his conviction that this decision was wrong. "Then don't give away something that meant so much to her without proper consideration," he said more gently. "The aircraft isn't just a valuable asset. It's a symbol of her independence, her ability to escape the constant scrutiny that comes with the crown. Shouldn't it remain available for future queens who might need that same escape?" Camilla sank into her chair, looking suddenly exhausted. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under, Sergeant Major. Every decision I make is scrutinized, criticized, compared to what she would have done. The press watches my every move, waiting for me to make a mistake. My own stepchildren treat me with polite distance. And my son gets nothing from this family except tolerance." Wellington realized he was seeing Camilla's vulnerability for the first time. Behind the royal title and regal bearing was a woman trying to navigate an impossible situation while protecting her child. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "I understand that you want to help Prince Tom, but there are better ways to do that than giving him something that belonged to Queen Elizabeth. Ways that won't raise questions about your judgment or respect for royal tradition." Camilla looked up at him with tired eyes. "Such as?" Wellington had been thinking about this throughout their conversation. The late Queen established several charitable foundations that need leadership. Prince Tom could be given a meaningful role in one of them, or perhaps he could be appointed to oversee the royal art collection, or manage one of the smaller royal residences. These would be honors that create value rather than just transferring existing assets. For the first time since the conversation began, Camilla seemed to consider his words seriously. And the aircraft? Should remain available for official royal use as the Queen intended. Perhaps it could be designated specifically for private family emergencies or confidential travel that requires discretion. That would honor both its original purpose and the late Queen's wishes. Camilla picked up the transfer document and stared at it for a long moment. Wellington held his breath, knowing that whatever happened next would determine not just the fate of the aircraft, but possibly his own future at the palace. "You realize," she said slowly, "that if I don't sign this, and if I take your suggestion about finding another role for Tom, it will look like I gave in to pressure from a security guard. That won't help my authority here." Wellington considered this carefully. "Not if it's presented correctly, Your Majesty. You could announce that after careful consideration, you've decided the aircraft should remain available for official royal use, while simultaneously announcing Prince Tom's new charitable appointment. It would look like thoughtful planning rather than capitulation." Camilla was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing her options. Wellington could see the internal struggle playing out across her features, the desire to help her son warring with the recognition that Wellington might be right about the consequences. Finally, she picked up the transfer document and, to Wellington's relief, placed it in a desk drawer rather than signing it. "I need time to think about this," she said, "and I need to speak with His Majesty before making any final decisions." Wellington felt a surge of hope, but he knew the battle wasn't over yet. "Of course, Your Majesty. That would be wise." Camilla stood up and walked to the window again, her back to Wellington. "You've put me in a very difficult position, Sergeant Major. I hope you understand the gravity of what you've done here today." Wellington knew she was right. He had challenged royal authority in a way that could have serious consequences for his career, but he also knew he had done the right thing. "I understand completely, Your Majesty. I also hope you understand that my actions come from loyalty to this family and respect for the late Queen's memory." Without turning around, Camilla dismissed him with a wave of her hand. "We'll speak again about this matter. You may go." As Wellington left the office, he wondered if he had won a battle or started a war. The next 2 days passed in an atmosphere of tension that seemed to permeate every corner of Buckingham Palace. Wellington continued his duties with professional precision, but he could feel the eyes of other staff members on him. Word had clearly spread about his confrontation with Queen Camilla, though the details remained murky. In the carefully orchestrated world of royal protocol, such direct challenges were almost unheard of. Wellington found himself wondering if he had made a terrible mistake. His wife, Margaret, had listened to his account of the meeting with growing concern, pointing out that challenging the Queen Consort could end not just his career, but also affect his pension and reputation. But when she asked if he would do it again, Wellington had answered without hesitation. Yes. On Thursday morning, Wellington received a summons that made his stomach drop. He was to report to the King's private study at precisely 10 o'clock. This wasn't about his regular security briefings. This was about the confrontation with Camilla. As he walked through the palace corridors, Wellington noticed that several staff members avoided making eye contact with him. It was as if he had become radioactive. The King's private study was a more modest room than most people would expect, filled with books, personal photographs, and comfortable furniture that reflected Charles's environmental consciousness. When Wellington knocked and entered, he found King Charles III standing by a window, still in his morning coat from an earlier engagement. "Sergeant Major Wellington," the king said without turning around. "Please have a seat." Wellington remained standing, as was protocol, but Charles gestured more insistently toward a chair. "Sit down, James. We need to have a conversation, not a formal briefing." The use of his first name was both reassuring and ominous. Wellington sat carefully on the edge of the offered chair. King Charles turned from the window and studied Wellington with tired but intelligent eyes. At 74, the new king carried the weight of his new responsibilities heavily, and the stress showed in the lines around his eyes. "My wife tells me you had quite an interesting discussion about her late mother's aircraft," Charles said, settling into his own chair. "She says you were rather forceful in your objections to her plans." Wellington chose his words carefully. "I expressed concerns about the decision, Your Majesty. I felt it was my duty to do so." Charles nodded slowly. "She also tells me you made some rather specific claims about conversations you had with my mother regarding her intentions for the aircraft." This was the moment Wellington had been dreading. He could lie and hope that no records existed to contradict him, or he could tell the truth and hope the king would understand his motivations. "Your Majesty," Wellington began, then stopped and started again. "I may have emphasized certain conversations in a way that made them seem more specific than they actually were. But the sentiment behind what I said was absolutely true. Your mother did care deeply about what would happen to her personal belongings, and she did value the independence that aircraft represented." King Charles was quiet for a long moment, studying Wellington's face. "So you lied to my wife." "I stretched the truth in service of what I believe to be the late Queen's wishes and the Crown's best interests," Wellington replied, meeting the king's gaze directly. To Wellington's surprise, Charles almost smiled. "My mother would have appreciated the distinction, I think. She always said that sometimes protecting the monarchy required creative interpretation of the rules." Wellington felt a glimmer of hope, but remained cautious. "I meant no disrespect to Queen Camilla, Your Majesty. I simply felt that the decision needed more consideration." Charles stood and walked to his desk, where Wellington could see the transfer document that Camilla had been prepared to sign. "You know, James, in all the years I knew my mother, she spoke to me exactly once about that aircraft. Do you know what she said?" Wellington shook his head. "She said it was the only place she could go where no one could reach her, where she could just be Elizabeth Windsor instead of the Queen. She said it represented freedom in a life that had precious little of it." Charles picked up the document and looked at it. "I think she would be heartbroken to know it was going to become someone's personal toy." The relief Wellington felt was overwhelming, but he tried not to show it. "What will happen to the aircraft, Your Majesty?" Charles set the document down and looked at Wellington seriously. "That depends partly on how we handle this situation. Camilla is understandably upset about being challenged so directly. She feels her authority has been undermined, and frankly, she's not wrong about that." Wellington's heart sank again. "I understand, Your Majesty. But," Charles continued, "she's also beginning to understand that the decision was made too hastily. The question now is how we resolve this in a way that preserves everyone's dignity." Wellington waited, knowing that his fate was entirely in the king's hands. Charles returned to his chair and leaned forward. "Here's what we're going to do. Camilla will announce that after careful consideration with the family, she has decided that the aircraft should remain available for official royal use. At the same time, we'll announce that Tom Parker Bowles is being appointed as patron of the Queen Elizabeth Memorial Gardens project, a new initiative that will create a series of public gardens in her memory." Wellington nodded, recognizing the wisdom of the solution. "That sounds very appropriate, Your Majesty." "The appointment will come with a modest annual allowance and significant prestige," Charles continued. "Tom will have something meaningful to do that honors my mother's memory while serving the public. Everyone wins." Wellington felt enormous relief, but he could sense there was more coming. Charles's expression became more serious. "However, there's the matter of your conduct, James. You challenged the Queen Consort directly and, by your own admission, stretched the truth to make your point. That can't be ignored." Wellington's stomach tightened. "I understand, Your Majesty." "You've served this family faithfully for 30 years, Charles said. "You were my mother's favorite among the security staff, and she trusted you completely. But what you did sets a dangerous precedent. If staff members can challenge royal decisions whenever they disagree, we'll have chaos." Wellington nodded, accepting whatever punishment was coming. "So here's what will happen," Charles continued. "Officially, you'll receive a written reprimand for exceeding your authority. Unofficially, you'll also receive a commendation for your loyalty and dedication to protecting the Crown's interests, even at personal risk." Wellington was stunned. "Your Majesty?" Charles stood, indicating the meeting was ending. "Sometimes doing the right thing requires accepting both consequences and recognition, James. My mother taught me that. She also taught me to value people who have the courage to speak truth to power, even when it's uncomfortable." As Wellington rose to leave, Charles added one final thought. "Just remember, this was an exceptional situation. I trust it won't become a habit." Wellington smiled for the first time in days. "No, Your Majesty. I think once in 30 years is quite enough." The week following Wellington's meeting with King Charles was filled with careful orchestration behind palace walls. The royal communications team worked overtime to craft announcements that would present the resolution as planned policy, rather than damage control. Wellington watched the process with fascination, seeing firsthand how the modern monarchy managed public perception while navigating internal conflicts. Queen Camilla had not spoken to Wellington directly since their confrontation, but he noticed subtle changes in her behavior around the palace. She seemed more thoughtful in her interactions with staff, asking questions rather than simply issuing orders. It was as if their confrontation had reminded her that the people around her were more than just servants. They were guardians of institutional memory and tradition. On Wednesday morning, Wellington was surprised to receive another summons to the Queen's office. This time, however, the atmosphere was completely different. Camilla sat behind her desk, but her posture was relaxed rather than defensive. The transfer document was nowhere to be seen. "Sergeant Major," she said as he entered, "please sit down. I think we need to finish our conversation properly." Wellington took the offered chair, unsure what to expect. Camilla looked at him thoughtfully. "I've spent the past week thinking about what you said, about the late Queen's wishes, about tradition, about the significance of that aircraft. I've also spoken extensively with His Majesty about the complexities of my position here." Wellington remained silent, sensing that she needed to work through her thoughts aloud. "You were right," she continued, the admission clearly difficult for her. "I was making the decision for emotional reasons rather than practical ones. I wanted to give Tom something significant because I felt guilty about the limitations placed on him by his position in this family. But giving him the Queen's aircraft wouldn't have solved those problems. It would have created new ones." Wellington felt a surge of respect for her honesty. "Your Majesty, I understand the difficulty of your position. It can't be easy balancing personal relationships with royal responsibilities." Camilla smiled wryly. "That may be the understatement of the century, Sergeant Major. Do you know what the hardest part is? It's not the public scrutiny or the protocol or even the constant comparison to Diana and Elizabeth. It's the feeling that I'm always walking on eggshells with my own family, trying to prove that I belong here, without overstepping boundaries that seem to shift constantly." Wellington was struck by her vulnerability. "The late Queen once told me that the crown is both a privilege and a burden. She said the key was remembering that it's not really about you. It's about what you represent." "Did she really say that?" Camilla asked, leaning forward with interest. "She did," Wellington confirmed. "It was after Princess Diana's death when the public was angry about the royal family's response. She said that sometimes doing what's right for the institution meant accepting personal criticism and misunderstanding." Camilla was quiet for a moment, processing this. "You know, James, may I call you James? I think I've been so focused on trying to establish my authority that I forgot why that authority matters in the first place." Wellington was surprised by the informal use of his first name, but it felt appropriate given the direction of their conversation. "Authority without wisdom is just power, Your Majesty, and power without purpose is dangerous." "The late Queen taught you well," Camilla observed. "No wonder she trusted you so completely." Wellington felt a familiar pang of grief at the mention of Queen Elizabeth. "She was an extraordinary woman. I miss her guidance more than I can express." Camilla nodded, understanding. "We all do. But perhaps that's why this conversation needed to happen. You weren't just protecting an aircraft, you were protecting her legacy and the principles she lived by." The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Camilla's private secretary entered with a tray of tea, setting it down on the small table between their chairs before withdrawing discreetly. As Camilla poured tea for both of them, she continued their discussion. "His Majesty tells me that you'll be receiving both a reprimand and a commendation for your actions. How do you feel about that?" Wellington accepted his cup gratefully. "I think it's fair, Your Majesty. I overstepped my bounds, but I did so for the right reasons. Sometimes life is complicated enough that simple judgments don't work." "Indeed," Camilla agreed. "I'm learning that being queen is largely about navigating those complications with grace." They sipped their tea in comfortable silence for a few moments before Camilla spoke again. "I want you to know that Tom is very excited about his new appointment with the Memorial Gardens project. He's already full of ideas about incorporating sustainable gardening practices and creating educational programs for children." Wellington smiled. "That sounds perfect for him. The late Queen would be pleased to know her memory is inspiring environmental education." "She would, wouldn't she?" Camilla's eyes lit up. "I think this solution serves everyone's interests much better than my original plan." Wellington set down his teacup and looked at Camilla seriously. Your Majesty, if I may say so, I think you're going to be an excellent queen. You're willing to listen, to admit when you're wrong, and to change course when necessary. Those are rare qualities in any leader. Camilla looked surprised by the compliment. Thank you, James. That means more to me than you might realize. I know I have large shoes to fill, and sometimes I feel overwhelmed by the expectations. The late queen felt the same way when she was crowned, Wellington revealed. She told me once that she spent her first year as queen terrified that she would make a mistake that would damage the monarchy forever. But she learned that the institution is stronger than any individual, and that doing your best with good intentions is usually enough. Camilla finished her tea and set down the cup with a decisive clink. Well then, I suppose we should both get back to doing our best with good intentions.
But James, I want you to know that I value your perspective.
Don't be afraid to speak up if you see something that concerns you. Just perhaps next time, could you be a bit more diplomatic about it? Wellington grinned. I'll do my best, Your Majesty, though I can't promise that diplomatic is my strongest suit. No, Camilla laughed. I don't suppose it is, but sometimes that's exactly what's needed. As Wellington prepared to leave, Camilla added one final thought. The aircraft will be used for its first official flight next month. His Majesty is taking it to Scotland for a private family gathering at Balmoral. I think the late Queen would approve. Wellington felt a deep sense of satisfaction as he left the office. The confrontation that had begun with tension and conflict had ended with mutual respect and understanding. More importantly, Queen Elizabeth's beloved aircraft would continue serving the purpose she had intended, providing the royal family with private space away from the constant scrutiny of public life. 3 weeks after his final conversation with Queen Camilla, Wellington found himself standing in the royal hangar at RAF Northolt, watching as maintenance crews prepared the late Queen's aircraft for its first official flight under the new arrangements. The sleek private jet gleamed under the hangar lights, its royal blue livery pristine and dignified. King Charles and several family members would be flying to Balmoral that afternoon for a private gathering to mark what would have been Queen Elizabeth's birthday. It was exactly the kind of occasion she had envisioned when she purchased the aircraft, a moment when the royal family needed to travel together without the formality and public scrutiny that accompanied official flights. Wellington had requested permission to be present for the departure, wanting to see the aircraft fulfill its intended purpose one more time. As he watched the final preparations, he reflected on how much had changed in just a month. The crisis that had begun with a hasty decision about transferring ownership had evolved into something much more significant, a realignment of relationships and understanding within the royal household. The sound of approaching vehicles drew his attention to the hangar entrance. The royal convoy arrived precisely on schedule, with King Charles emerging from the first car, followed by Prince William, Princess Catherine, and several other family members. Queen Camilla stepped out of the second vehicle, elegant in a navy coat that complemented the aircraft's livery. Wellington noticed immediately how different the atmosphere was compared to their first confrontation. Camilla moved with quiet confidence, greeting the flight crew warmly and checking personally that all arrangements were in order. She had found her footing as queen, balancing authority with genuine care for those around her. As the family began boarding the aircraft, Wellington observed the subtle dynamics at play. Prince William spoke easily with his stepmother, clearly having moved past any earlier tensions. The younger royals chatted excitedly about spending time at Balmoral, the Scottish estate that had always been the family's most private retreat. King Charles paused at the aircraft steps and looked around the hangar until he spotted Wellington. With a slight nod, he beckoned the security chief over. "James," the king said warmly, "I'm glad you're here to see this. Mother would have been pleased to know her aircraft is being used exactly as she intended." Wellington felt a familiar tightness in his throat at the mention of Queen Elizabeth. "She would indeed, Your Majesty. She always said that Balmoral was where the family could just be themselves." "Quite right," Charles agreed. "And thanks to your intervention, we'll arrive there in the aircraft she chose for precisely these moments." Queen Camilla appeared at the king's side, having completed her final checks with the crew. "James," she said with genuine warmth, "thank you for being here. I know this means something special to you." Wellington was touched by her thoughtfulness. "It does, Your Majesty. Thank you for understanding why this was so important. Camilla smiled. I think we all learned something valuable from this experience. Sometimes the best decisions are the ones we take time to reconsider. As the royal family settled into the aircraft, Wellington stepped back to watch the departure preparations. The engine spooled up with a quiet whine, and ground crew members began their final safety checks. Through the aircraft windows, he could see the family members taking their seats, some already deep in conversation while others gazed out at the hangar. The aircraft captain, a veteran pilot who had flown Queen Elizabeth many times, emerged briefly to speak with Wellington. "Feels good to have her flying again, doesn't it?" he said, patting the aircraft's fuselage affectionately. The Queen always said this old bird knew the way to Scotland by heart. Wellington nodded, remembering the many flights he had taken with Queen Elizabeth to various destinations. She had always been a nervous flyer, but something about this particular aircraft had put her at ease. Perhaps it was the familiar surroundings, or maybe just the knowledge that it was truly hers, bought with her own money and maintained to her exacting standards. As the aircraft began to taxi toward the runway, Wellington felt a presence beside him. Tom Parker Bowles had arrived to see his mother off, carrying a briefcase full of preliminary plans for the Queen Elizabeth Memorial Gardens project. "Sergeant Major," Tom said, extending his hand, "I wanted to thank you personally for what you did. I know it wasn't easy to challenge my mother, but you probably saved our family from a significant scandal." Wellington shook the young man's hand, impressed by his maturity. "Your new project sounds wonderful, Mr. Parker Bowles. I think it's exactly the kind of memorial the late Queen would have wanted." Tom's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "We're planning to create 7 gardens across the UK, each focusing on different aspects of conservation and environmental education. The Queen was so passionate about these issues, and this project will ensure her legacy continues to inspire future generations." Wellington could see why Camilla was so proud of her son. Tom had taken what could have been a disappointment and turned it into genuine excitement about meaningful work. They watched together as the aircraft reached the runway and began its takeoff roll. The jet lifted gracefully into the afternoon sky, banking slightly as it turned north toward Scotland. Wellington imagined the conversations taking place inside, family members sharing memories, making plans, and simply enjoying the rare opportunity to be together without official duties. "You know," Tom said as the aircraft disappeared into the distance, "Mother told me about your confrontation with her. She said it was the first time in months that someone had challenged her to think about what she was doing, rather than just accepting her authority." Wellington was surprised by this revelation. "I hope she didn't take it as disrespect." "Quite the opposite," Tom assured him. "She said it reminded her that being queen isn't about having power over people, it's about being responsible to them." She's been different since then, more thoughtful about her decisions. As they walked back toward the hangar entrance, Wellington reflected on the unexpected turns his confrontation with Queen Camilla had taken. What had begun as a desperate attempt to protect Queen Elizabeth's memory had evolved into something much more valuable, a deeper understanding. Between the new queen and those who served the crown, the afternoon sun was beginning to set as Wellington prepared to return to his regular duties at the palace. The aircraft was now somewhere over northern England, carrying the royal family toward a weekend of private memories and family bonding. In a few days, it would return them to London, where official duties would resume and public scrutiny would continue. But for this moment, Queen Elizabeth's aircraft was doing exactly what she had always wanted it to do, giving her family the gift of privacy and the freedom to simply be themselves above the clouds. 6 months later, Wellington stood in the same palace courtyard where this story had begun. But everything had changed. The morning sun cast the same long shadows, but the atmosphere around him felt different, more settled, more purposeful. The crisis over Queen Elizabeth's aircraft had become a turning point, not just for that particular decision, but for how the entire royal household approached change and tradition. The Queen Elizabeth Memorial Gardens project had exceeded everyone's expectations. Tom Parker Bowles had thrown himself into the work with genuine passion, and the first garden in Windsor was already drawing visitors from around the world. The media had praised the initiative as a perfect tribute to the late Queen's environmental legacy, and Tom had found his calling as a conservation advocate. More importantly, The relationship between Queen Camilla and the palace staff had evolved dramatically. She now held regular consultation meetings with senior staff before making significant decisions, and had established what she called tradition reviews, Camilla formal, discussions about how new initiatives might affect established royal customs. Wellington had noticed the changes in small ways throughout the months. Camilla asked more questions now, listened more carefully to advice, and showed genuine interest in understanding the historical context behind palace protocols. She had also developed a habit of visiting different departments personally, learning about their work and challenges rather than simply issuing directives from her office. The aircraft itself had become a symbol of successful resolution. It had been used for several private royal trips, including a particularly meaningful flight to Scotland when Princess Catherine gave birth to her third child and the family wanted to introduce the new baby to the extended family at Balmoral without media intrusion. On this particular morning, Wellington had been summoned to what had become a monthly tradition, an informal breakfast meeting between Queen Camilla and the heads of various palace departments. These gatherings had proven invaluable for maintaining communication and preventing the kind of misunderstanding that had led to their original confrontation. As Wellington entered the smaller dining room that Camilla preferred for these meetings, he found the Queen already present with the palace secretary, the head of communications, and the chief of staff. The atmosphere was relaxed and collegial, a far cry from the formal hierarchy that had once characterized royal meetings. "James," Camilla greeted him warmly. "Perfect timing. We were just discussing the upcoming state visit from the Australian Prime Minister. I wanted your input on security arrangements for the private dinner we're planning." Wellington took his seat and accepted coffee from the attending staff member. These meetings had taught him to expect the unexpected. Conversations that began about security might evolve into discussions about royal traditions, family dynamics, or even personal concerns. "The Australian visit should be straightforward from a security perspective," Wellington began, but Camilla held up a hand. "Before we get to business," she said, "I have some news I wanted to share with all of you. His Majesty and I have been discussing the future of the late Queen's aircraft, and we've decided to establish it as a permanent memorial flight service." Wellington set down his coffee cup. Intrigued by this development, Camilla continued with obvious enthusiasm. "The aircraft will be used exclusively for charitable and memorial purposes. Organizations working on causes that were dear to the late Queen will be able to apply for transportation to events, conferences, and initiatives that advance her legacy. It will be managed by Tom's Foundation, ensuring that every flight serves a meaningful purpose." The palace secretary leaned forward with interest. "That's a wonderful way to honor her memory while ensuring the aircraft continues to serve the public good." Wellington felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This solution went far beyond his original goal of simply preventing the transfer to Tom Parker Bowles. It transformed the aircraft into something that would actively advance Queen Elizabeth's values and causes for years to come. The first memorial flight will take a delegation of environmental scientists to a climate conference in Geneva, Camilla added. "They're working on renewable energy solutions for remote communities, exactly the kind of initiative the Queen would have supported." As the conversation continued, Wellington reflected on how dramatically his relationship with Queen Camilla had evolved. The woman who had once viewed him as an obstacle to her authority now trusted him enough to include him in strategic planning discussions. Their confrontation had been painful for both of them, but it had ultimately created a foundation of mutual respect that made their working relationship stronger. The meeting progressed through various topics: upcoming royal engagements, staffing changes, and plans for the Queen's first state visit as host. Wellington contributed his perspective on security matters, but he also found himself offering insights on protocol and tradition that Camilla valued. As the meeting concluded, Camilla asked Wellington to stay behind for a private conversation. When the others had left, she poured fresh coffee for both of them and settled back in her chair. "James," she said, "I've been thinking about that day 6 months ago when you challenged me about the aircraft. Do you know what struck me most about that confrontation?" Wellington shook his head, curious about her perspective. "It wasn't your defiance or even your passion about protecting the Queen's memory," Camilla continued. "It was the realization that you cared more about doing what was right than about protecting your own position. That level of integrity is rare, and I've come to value it enormously. Wellington was touched by her words. Thank you, Your Majesty. I hope I can continue to serve with that same integrity. Camilla smiled. I'm sure you will. But I also want you to know that our working relationship has taught me something important about leadership. Real authority doesn't come from demanding obedience. It comes from earning respect through good decisions and genuine care for those you serve. Wellington nodded, remembering similar words from Queen Elizabeth years earlier. Which brings me to why I asked you to stay, Camilla continued. His Majesty and I have been discussing the future of palace security, and we'd like to offer you a promotion. We want you to become the new Director of Royal Protection, overseeing all security operations for the family. Wellington was stunned. The position was significantly higher than his current role and would make him one of the most senior staff members in the entire royal household. Your Majesty, I'm honored, but I should point out that I challenged your authority just 6 months ago. Are you certain this is wise? Camilla laughed, a genuine warm sound that had become more common in recent months. James, that's exactly why we want you in this position. We need someone who will tell us the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. We need someone who values the institution more than his own career advancement. Wellington felt overwhelmed by the trust being placed in him. I accept, Your Majesty, and I promise to continue serving with the same dedication to truth and integrity. I wouldn't expect anything less, Camilla replied. As Wellington prepared to leave, Camilla added one final thought. You know, the late Queen once told me that the monarchy's greatest strength was its ability to evolve while maintaining its core values. I think our experience with the aircraft perfectly exemplifies that principle. Wellington paused at the door. How so, Your Majesty? We took a potential crisis and turned it into an opportunity for growth, understanding, and positive change, Camilla explained. The aircraft will now serve the public good in ways the Queen never imagined. Tom has found meaningful work that honors her memory, and we've all learned to communicate more effectively. That's evolution without losing our essential character. As Wellington left the dining room and walked through the familiar palace corridors, he felt a profound sense of completion. The confrontation that had once threatened his career had instead led to his greatest professional opportunity. More importantly, it had helped transform the royal household into a more collaborative and thoughtful institution. Queen Elizabeth's aircraft would continue to fly, carrying forward her legacy of service and dedication to charitable causes. Queen Camilla had found her footing as a leader who balanced authority with wisdom. And Wellington had learned that sometimes the greatest service comes from having the courage to speak truth to power, regardless of the personal cost. The monarchy, as it always had, continued to evolve while honoring its deepest traditions.